In this video, we're going to take a look at the basics of using curves and creating surfaces in plasticity, so stay tuned. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to carry on with our new plasticity videos, but this time instead of doing a basic simple part with solids, we're going to start talking about curves and creating surfaces or sheets in plasticity. So this is sort of the next level of tools. Once you get out of these solid tools, then you're going to start experimenting with curves in 3D and building these sheets to help make complex designs. So in this video, we're going to cover a handful of topics. We're going to talk about importing blueprints or reference images. We're going to talk about how to change the transparency of those. We're going to talk about how to build curves in 2D that are projected into 3D. We'll talk about how to build curves in 3D. And we'll talk about creating surfaces and specifically about how we can avoid having a seam across the midline of our parts. So to get started, make sure that you do have some reference images or blueprint of a car. We're not going to be modeling the entire thing. We're not really going to stick that close to it, but we just want to have some reference image to bring in. I'm going to get started first by deleting this cube, and I want to begin by creating a corner rectangle. I'm going to start at the origin and begin dragging this out. As soon as I hit the Tab key on the keyboard, we're going to change to a center rectangle about that origin point that we clicked. So this is important for me because I like to work about the origin. It's a good reference for us. So make sure that you do get comfortable with hitting Tab and just see what it does in the tools that you're using. The next thing I want to do is manually enter some values. So I'm going to start by doing a width of 3, and I'm going to say a length of 8, and just see what that gives us. Hit enter. As soon as you see this on the screen, this is going to allow you to manually change the size of that rectangle. And you can play around with it until visually it looks right, or you can use the manual inputs, then right click or hit enter. Next, we're going to just click on that closed area and start dragging this up. Once again, we can do this sort of visually, just get a rough reference, or we can use numerical inputs if we have a specific size in mind. This is not required for this type of work, but there are a few benefits that I like from doing this, and we'll get to talking about that in just a little bit. Because I no longer need that original rectangle, I'm just going to select and delete it. The next step to this process is bringing in those images. Now, the images can be dragged and dropped in here, I'm told. Typically, the way I do this is I go to Import Append, and then I'm going to just bring in a blueprint. Now, in this case, I'm using an FDRX7. Don't get too excited. We're not going to be modeling this car, but any image that you have will work. At first, you can see we can't really see it. It's on the bottom of this cube. And what I want to do is I want to start by scaling this up using S. You can also just click on scale down here, but it's a good idea to get familiar with some of the shortcuts. Now I want to scale this up until the car is approximately the right size. I'm going to right click and then I'm going to use R to rotate. I'm going to rotate about Z, so Z on the keyboard, 90 degrees, and then right click to accept that. You can see that we're pretty close. Again, it doesn't really matter in this case, but I'm going to use GZ. I'm going to move it up. I like to put this just below the top of that cube, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit as to why. Now, because I scaled this reference image up, I'm going to duplicate it. That's Shift and D, or you can select it down here. So Shift and D, duplicate it, just right click to accept where it is, then R to rotate, Y about Y, and then enter 90 and say OK. Hit enter twice or right click. So now we're going to use G and X to bring it out in the X direction. I'm going to put it just in front of that cube. I'm going to use 3 on the number pad, which is going to be my X normal to X view. And then G and Z, we're going to move this down until the side of the car is on the cube and the tires rest on the bottom or the X axis. Right click to accept. And then G and X, we're going to move it back just behind the cube. Right click to accept. So at this point, a couple of things have to happen. First, I'm going to hide the solid. Next, I want to click on one of the empties and hit M on the keyboard. This is typically how we adjust the materials of a solid, but when we're talking about empties, we can turn on opacity, which will let us see through it. We're going to do the same thing for empty 1. M, toggle on the opacity. Default is 50%. We're going to say OK. And the next thing that we want to do is make sure that we toggle off the selection option. We don't want to be able to select these when we're drawing curves, especially when we're drawing on a construction plane. That just is going to cause us problems downstream, so make sure that we turn that off. The first thing that we want to do is we want to start to build out curves in 3D, and the way we're going to do this is by sketching in 2D. So I'm going to hit 3 on the keyboard. This goes to my right view, but it also means that I'm now creating my curves on the, in this case, the YZ plane. So as we look at this, we can see Y and Z here. We see our x-axis and our y-axis. So it's a little confusing at first, but typically when we're doing a sketch or something on a construction plane, just make sure that when you're looking at it like this, what you're actually doing is you're drawing your curve directly on that construction plane. Again, this is a reason why we built that solid. So we're not modeling too much of this car, so we're just going to kind of do a bit of the hood. And to do that, we're going to use a curve, holding down the left mouse button, and do it with a control point curve. Start at the front of the hood or whatever object you have, and then begin creating your control points. Remember, with control points, these are not going to lie on the curve or spline itself. It's going to be outside. Now, if you find yourself having issues with it trying to snap, just hold down the control or the command key, and that's going to allow you to temporarily override those snaps, and right-click when you're done. Now, at this point, if you didn't toggle off the selection of the empty, you wouldn't be able to select these control points and move them around because you'd be selecting the image. So that's why we needed to turn that off. Then we're going to use G for move and just begin slightly manipulating the curve. We're just going to click a couple times, make some adjustments. Again, we're not strictly trying to stick to this, but we just want to get the feel for moving things around and being able to play around with these curves until we're happy with their positions. So just move things around, play around with them, and once you're happy, go ahead and rotate it around. Make sure that that is on that construction plane. It is in the middle of your object. The next thing that we need to do is we need to begin creating a curve out in 3D. So the way we're going to do this is by bringing our solid back. We're going to select the outside face, and then we're going to hit spacebar, or also we're going to create plane from selection. So spacebar will allow you to do that. Now, one cool tip that we can do here is we can save that construction plane. So this is another benefit of having that sort of box as our reference. So now we hide the box. We don't really need to see it, but now we've got this custom plane, and we can double click on that to align our camera. Remember, it's important when we're aligned to these construction planes, that's where our curves are being created. So once again, create a new curve. This time we're going to be doing sort of the edge of the hood. I'm going to hold down control, and then I'm just going to hold down control the whole time. And I'm placing these control points sort of just behind the other ones that we created. Right click to accept, and then just position them a little bit. Again, not going to spend too much time here. Not really a point for us to worry too much about perfectly matching this because we're not modeling the entire car. I'd like to, but it's not going to be in this video. So I'm going to just move this one a little bit as well. Right click, and then rotate this around. Hit X to disable that construction plane. So this is now on the outside of that cube or that box, sitting just outside of that blueprint or reference image. And now we need to do the same thing from the top. So I'm going to bring the solid back, select the top, hit spacebar, save that temporary construction plane, hide the solid so we can see the blueprint again. And at this point, what I like to do is I like to use the line. I'm going to draw a line from the end point and sort of figure out where that needs to be. Remember, right click to accept. We'll do the same thing over here. Because it has a pop-up headlight, we have to sort of envision where that hood line is going to be. Now remember, whenever we're looking at a construction plane, we are creating our curves on it. So if we rotate this around, even though we snapped to those endpoints, we are on that construction plane. As we rotate this around, that construction plane is where those curves are going. So now if we're using our curve and we go from here, hold down control, and we just add a couple points, snap to the end, rotate this around, make sure it is still on that construction plane. You can also double click to align your camera back to that construction plane if you need it. Once we are sure those endpoints are in the right location, I go back and I delete these lines, and then I can begin manipulating these points with G to move, right click to accept, G to move, right click to accept. And for now, I want to hide the empties. I don't really need to see them at this point. But what we want to do is we want to project these until they intersect. Now, to get an idea for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select it and hit E to extrude and just pull it down. I'm going to do the same thing to this one, E to extrude and pull that over. And essentially what we're doing is we're building where those two surfaces are intersecting. That's what it's going to allow us to do. So I'm going to select these curves and I'm going to use I on the keyboard, which is also this project curve onto curve. And that'll build the curve essentially where those two are intersecting. So what it's doing is it's taking the temporary construction plane, that curve we created, and it's projecting it normal to that direction. So you can see here, we don't really need those sheets. I'm going to delete them. They were just there as a reference. And these curves we don't actually need either, but for now I just want to hide them. And we should now, if we bring our sheets back, we should now see those curves. 3 on the keyboard to look at it from X. Looks like it's in the right place. 7, and it looks like it's in the right place there as well. We're not quite done. The next thing that I want to do is hide the empties, and we're going to talk about making this thing mirrored and building it in 3D. Now, I do want to say the way that I would typically do this in CAD is only working on half of the surface and then mirror it across the midline. Now, while you can do that in plasticity, I don't currently know of a way to drive the tangency of that surface off of an edge, the direction of that curve, or anything like that. If somebody does know, please let me know. But as far as I know, you can't currently do that. So for example, if I took this and extruded it, I wouldn't be able to use that to drive tangency in a loft over here. So the way that I've been doing this is by taking this curve and using mirror or Alt X and mirroring it across the X-axis, which gives me a curve on the other side. So essentially what we're going to be doing is lofting from one curve to this middle and to the other side. So we need to make sure that we take care to use symmetry. And typically this only really needs to be done directly at the middle. So if you have, let's say, a detail, a feature, a ridge in the middle of your object, you really only need to do this right in the center. So you could model it with a slight ridge, then trim away the middle and build it that way. But the way that I found is to basically build a large surface doing this method. What we're going to do is we're going to use a spline curve. We're going to start at the end and just simply work our way to each of these points. Now, I do also want to mention that you can select curves and you can use L to loft between them. And in this case, you can tab between continuity and just create a line between those. And we can, try to bridge these vertices. Not really the way that works for something like this, but in some cases, just adding a curve between two of these edges, that would work pretty well. So what we're going to do is go here to the end. Make sure that you pay attention to the little tooltip that pops up next to the cursor. And essentially what we did is we just built out that guide that we're going to use when we build our surface. So now we get to build the surface in 3D. We're going to select these curves holding down Shift. We're going to use Loft, which is L on the keyboard. And then we're going to select the guides by first selecting this bottom, then holding down Shift and selecting the other guide, right-click to accept. Now the curves are no longer needed. You can delete them if you want, but if you do happen to need them for something, you want to keep them around. Make sure that you rename them so you know what they are. You can just double-click on them and then you can rename. In this case, let's say front edge, for example. So if I turn that back on, I should have called it back edge. But if you turn those back on and off, you'll kind of know what they are. Curve 63 doesn't really help me understand what it is. But you can see the reflections going across here look pretty good. We don't really have any issues there. We can toggle on different materials and just make sure that we do have a good quality surface. So there are a couple other things that I do want to mention when you are working with surfaces. So if you want to build curves in 3D, if you don't really like to create these curves that are projected, you certainly can do that. So for example, if we want to build a curve just in 2D and move it, we have that option. And I'm going to do that by sort of starting over here. I am going to just hold down Control again, and then just sort of build out another curve here. I'm going to take that entire thing using G, and I'm going to move it to approximately where I think it should be, and then begin looking at it from different views. So take this front control point, for example, G, And I'm going to begin moving it in. And if I'm happy with that, I'm going to use 1 on the keyboard. Make sure everything looks okay from that view. 3 on the keyboard. Make sure everything looks okay from that view. And then if I want to start connecting these, so for example, if we go back to this curve here, I can select these endpoints. I can use loft to bridge the curves. In this case, I don't want continuity between them. I want G0. And then I can subdivide this. Now, if we take a look at our options, you can see that we've got subdivide curve is Alt and +1. And what that's going to allow us to do is it'll give us this extra control point in the middle, and we can start using that to build out the curvature. So we're going to do the same thing on the back side. We need that back curve that I called front edge, and we're just going to bridge these two together, again using L for loft. Tab over to G0. We're going to subdivide. Again, that's Alt and 1, and then we can take that and move it in plane to give it some curvature. And now we've sort of got this control. Now, if we try to, let's say, change our selection to edges and go from here to here and try to create a loft, notice that it's not really working to go from edge to curve. Now, what I found is that it works pretty well when you go edge to edge or curve to curve, but it doesn't really work going edge to curve. So you need to figure out which curve you had. That was this one here. We're going to go from there to there. We're going to loft. We're going to add this as our guide. Shift to add this as our guide. Right click. I'm going to turn all the curves off together because I don't really need them at this point. And then notice that these are not automatically joined. So I'm going to hit 5 on the keyboard to bring all my selections back. And now if we're not going to use two together, which is Boolean, we're going to use J, which is join. Now this works for curves and it works for sheets. Now that it's joined together, we can select that edge and we can add a fillet or blend. Now, one thing I've noticed is that the fillets on these surfaces are not going to be as good as lofting between those edges. So typically what I would do is after I have this, I would then unjoin these. So you can use Alt and J, and that would bring this individual piece back. And then what we can do is we can loft between the edges. So we're going to go from here to here. I'm going to use 2 on the keyboard to make edge selection a little bit easier. L to loft, G2 continuity, right click, and then now I want to join all these together with J. And typically that loft is going to be a little bit better than the fillet. There are some fillet options that you can do, but I think that loft gives you a little bit better result, at least currently. So that is the basics of working with curves in 3D, working with imported reference images, as well as building out these sheets or these surfaces. So at this point, if you have a surface, what can you do with it? Well, if you select the entire sheet, we do have a thicken option. We can thicken a sheet, and then you can give it a thickness value. So if you want to use this as a basis to build out some sort of complex shape, then at the end, you can use the thicken, and now we have a solid body. So it's a great way for us to start building out complex shapes that maybe the traditional prismatic shapes don't really work for. It just takes a little bit of extra patience and practice to work with these curves in 3D. But at this point, if you have any questions, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.